excelling in many ways, keeping the system reliable. But what looms out in front of us are tremendous challenges, but also opportunities.
This shift in the generation mix more toward wind solar batteries, when we're looking at enough supply to meet the demand, how does the generation mix factor into that equation?
The risk factors are less about the mechanical failures and more about, well, what's the likelihood the wind will go down? What's the likelihood the sun will be cloudy?
The data centers have the capacity to also amplify reliability.
There's opportunity within its controllability to provide flexibility into the grid. Reliability really shouldn't be a real-time observation activity. Really is something that we ought to be planning in advance. Then we can kind of work on the affordability and security piece as well.
I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and welcome back to Power Perspectives. 3 words every utility pro hears in their dreams: affordability, resilience, and reliability. Of that 3-legged stool, the last one, reliability, is perhaps the most crucial. It's reliability that ensures the lights go on when we flip the switch, that keeps critical infrastructure like hospitals and airports and World Cup stadiums functioning safely without disruption, that makes sure all of this rampant demand has supply to back it up. Now, the US electric grid is by all accounts highly functional. It works well most of the time, but reliability is trending in a strange direction, with electrification and manufacturing and data centers and the rest of the demand-spiking laundry list that you know all too well. The truth is, Americans experience more outages now than they did a decade ago, with the average annual outage time exceeding 360 minutes. Still pretty great. 360 minutes is only about as long as it takes to watch The Matrix 2.5 times, but that does mean that our grid is at times less reliable than that of other developed countries. So, what are leaders doing to ensure that the trend heads back up? Because the grid gets more and more complex, that means our reliability needs are only increasing. Today, we have an energy pro whose job is squarely in that all-important niche. John Moura is Director of Reliability Assessment and System Analysis at NERC. His job? Figure out how reliable the North American bulk power system really is. And today, John is here to tell us what he's found, what it means, and where we're headed. John, welcome to Power Perspectives. How are you today?
Hi, Kinsey. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, I'm thrilled to have you. We're going to have a great conversation today. This is a topic that a lot of our listeners care very deeply about, as I'm sure you are not surprised to hear. But I want to start by really setting the scene and getting an understanding of that where we are, as I mentioned in the introduction. So if you don't mind, could you sum up the state of the power grid reliability in North America in, maybe one sentence? I would challenge you to one sentence. Tell me what's going on right now with reliability.
Yeah, I think you opened it up really great, and the premise is right on track. Our whole grid has evolved so much in the past couple decades. We're using electricity in so many different ways than we have in the past. We're excelling in many ways, keeping the system reliable. But what looms out in front of us are some tremendous challenges, but also opportunities. New data center growth can really amplify the grid's reliability, not challenge it if we plan it correctly. So I'm excited about the future and excited about talking a little bit more about the challenges we have in front of us.
That's a great way to put it, that these challenges and opportunities can really coexist in one specific example like data centers, but I'm sure across the board too. If you had to give a grade to grid reliability these days, what would you give us here? What would you score us in the US in terms of reliability right now?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Different parts of the country are at, I would say different risk levels. We don't have kind of traditional grades in our assessments, but when we do look at reliability and try to communicate those risks, there's not really any one metric that tells it all. Reliability is a pretty complicated thing to comprehend. You can think about it around, how much capacity areas have, or you can think about it around how stable certain areas are, making sure they have enough transmission. So there's kind of many ways to look at it. And so when you look at different parts of the country, some areas really have a lot less risk factors. It's kind of how I would put it than other areas, right? We can't really predict their performance, but we can look at the risk factors. Some areas have, for example, retired a lot of generation over the years. A lot of that generation was highly certain, highly reliable. Kind of, you're able to look in your backyard, look at the coal piles and say, okay, 1 month, 2 month, 3 months of coal, I'm good, under almost any emergency condition. But now that we've really retired some of those units, we've brought on more wind and solar, which is good during real good times of wind and sun, but might not be as good during, for example, winter peaks when the sun's not really shining and the wind's not blowing. So there's challenges that certain areas have had to have to overcome in the future. But what we know for certain is that this is pretty much the riskiest the power grid has ever been. Well, for many decades, we've had ample reserves, and over the past couple of years, we've retired the generation. So there are challenges looming, but I remain, opportunistic about the future because the large loads, those data centers that are coming online, while they can be challenging to meet, really represent a huge boon for the industry and also really helps address the affordability challenge I think you mentioned in your opening.
What would you say are some of the biggest factors that create that reality that you mentioned that we are at a risky time for the grid? Tell me a little bit more about what informs that risk.
Great follow up. So, let's take a look at an area like Texas, and let's also compare that to California. Two standout areas that I think highlight a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. So in California and in Texas, both areas have been able to build a lot of solar and storage resources. That's really been helpful for meeting summer peak conditions. Sun shines during summer peak, and then as the sun goes down, this 4 hour storage can jump in and help smooth out some of those peaks. Now, in California's case, that has reduced risk and it pretty much works all year round. They don't really have those harsh winters every now and then. Texas, very similar strategy, and they built out incredible amount of solar and storage. It's been very helpful for meeting summer peaks, but in the winter time, solar and storage isn't very helpful. Some winter peak happens early morning and early evening when the sun's already down, and storage really only lasts about 4 hours. So not very helpful. So the risk factor, right? They both had the same build out strategy, but the risk factors in Texas show increasing risks that are happening during those winter conditions because of some of the generation choices that have been built out. Um, Another risk factor is increasing amount of natural gas that's being utilized with maybe not as many pipeline connections to increase that resilience of pipelines. Again, we're counting on natural gas as to help us be resilient against winter conditions. But time and time again, we've had some challenges in both the production, real time production of natural gas, you know, winter freeze offs of the fuel sources, but also some pipeline constraints where not enough gas gets to the generators that need that gas may have not procured the gas but still need it, and so that is an increasing factor that we see as well. So those are just a couple highlights. Can go on and on about where the concentration of large loads and data centers are, where wildfires are, where GMD, geomagnetic disturbance risks are, where drought conditions prevail. So when we do our assessments, we kind of look at all these risk factors, and our grading is more of a risk element, which is a normal risk, elevated risk, and high risk, and really the culmination of all those risks come into how we risk rank different areas across the country.
Yeah, and it's an important point, John, that you make that not No two territories, no two regions of this country are the same when we're looking at the risk that they're facing, when we're looking at the reliability realities that they're facing, and I think that we'll dig more into
Yeah.
kind of what that looks like. But, across the country, we have seen and across the industry, we have seen this shift in the generation mix for energy, broadly speaking, and this was a big part of what you were just mentioning. Do you see this shift in the generation mix, more toward wind, solar, batteries, knowing that they're cheaper to add to the grid, knowing that they can serve certain purposes for power generators here? Does that impact resource adequacy in any way? When we're looking at enough supply to meet the demand, how does the generation mix factor into that equation?
Almost everything in the power system contributes to that resource adequacy. The way we integrate it into our assessments as we think about resource adequacy is trying to understand all the different constraints on the system. I like an analogy that I think might be useful here. Well, let's try it out. So, if I'm a casino owner, bear with me, I might have to do some analysis to determine, well, what's the rare possibility and off chance that I'll lose $1 million in a day, right? They might have to do that type of a rare analysis. And so the way they do that analysis is they look at all the different games that they have. They have craps, they have blackjack, they have the slot machines, and they total up all the different probabilities and statistics about those machines. And they run what we call a Monte Carlo analysis that runs thousands and hundreds of different simulations and calculates the different potential and outputs a probability distribution of the odds that that area that casino might lose $1 million in a day, right? So what are all the factors that go into that analysis, right? Which is really, what's the probability, players might win at blackjack? What's the probability of players might win at slots? So that all that goes into that analysis. Point is, this is the same analysis resource adequacy and resource planners do. Instead of the games, it's the different generators. And so, what the resource adequacy planners are doing is looking at all the forced outage rates of the generators, right? So, every generator's got a force. So, what's the probability that each generator fails? Is essentially the analysis. And it used to be, when we were mostly conventional generation, it used to be a statistical operation where you look at the mechanical failure rates of a steam turbine or a boiler or all these components of generators. As you build more renewable, the risk factors are less about the mechanical failures and more about, well, what's the likelihood the wind will go down, right? What's the likelihood the sun, will be cloudy, right? And so those are much more likely than mechanical failures of generators. And so as you get more, the wind, as the point is, the wind and the sun, depending if it's windy or sunny, becomes a large contributor as to whether or not areas have energy. Because the final point is, at low levels, it's almost insignificant. You can integrate, the first 5% is pretty easy to integrate renewables. But as you get to 10, 30, 40% renewables, you can have these days. It happens so often in Europe. They call it the Dunkelflaute. It's a German word. They call it the Dunkelflaute, which means a renewable drought. And so, it happens so often they had to create a name for it. And of course, Germans create names for everything. But this is a challenge where the wind dies down for maybe 2 or 3 days, right? And the sun is and it's cloudy conditions for several days, kind of at the same time. And so those are conditions that system operators and planners have to now plan for.
Yeah, I think this is such an important part too of the calculus of renewables in the United States and across our grid. I think it illustrates the reality that so many operators and leaders are facing today, which is a whole litany of factors and circumstances and impacts that have a force that they bring to the table when you're thinking about what you build for the future. I think the other element that feels really significant here is the pace of change. A lot has changed really, really quickly, at least is what it seems like to me when we're looking at the generation mix, at resource adequacy, when we're thinking about what that future looks like. How do you see the sort of impacts having changed over the years? Can you put into context at all the pace of change when we're thinking about reliability and the big picture for the US grid right now?
Yeah, it's kind of almost everything. I got a story for that. It used to be, it used to be where because we've been as an industry integrating large loads and you know evolving and changing over time. But it used to be where you have a large load, maybe 100 megawatts, a large paper mill. You call the local power company and you say, "Hey, I want to integrate, a 100 megawatt paper mill," and they say, "Yeah, when do you need it?" And the paper mill would say, well, it'll take me about, 7 to 10 years to build this thing. And then the utility guys would say, oh, well, it'll take me about 7 to 10 years to build the generation and transmission. And so the pace of change were kind of congruent between the industrial and again, commercial needs and the industry. And right now they're incongruent. We can build these loads much quicker than we ever dreamed possible. And so the industry is really kind of playing catch up, evolving. I think we're changing pretty rapidly, but we're evolving our processes that were very linear, very not batch work. We're doing now, being able to change the system without compromising any reliability or soundness in the engineering. And in fact, not only the pace is more rapid, but compounded by the previous analytics I just described, which is kind of compounding these complex challenges. So that pace is much different than it was in the past, even though we brought on large loads much quicker. And I think everything is kind of really constrained. The reason why we're worried about the pace of change is we're constrained by the pace that we can bring on generation and transmission. Lot of that has to do with policies at the state level, policies at the federal level. All these challenges in siting and permitting new infrastructure, both on the electric and gas side. We're incredibly challenged by that, but my hope is a lot of these challenges have been not only identified but magnified most recently, and we want to see areas, especially market areas, be able to enhance their structures to advance the both the capacity and the transmission build outs.
Yeah, I think we'll dig more into what it looks like to be more productive when we're thinking about the generation and transmission build out and you know uh, figuring out that concern, which is significant. But before we do, you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that data centers have the capacity to also amplify reliability. When we're talking about the pace of change over the last, let's call it decade, obviously the influx of data centers is one of the biggest parts of that conversation. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that when we're looking at these huge hyperscalers, large loads coming on in concentrated areas. How can that potentially positively impact reliability?
So, at the levels that we hear and we are already seeing data centers at, which are, plus 300 megawatts, gigawatts, 2 gigawatt, these are become really, they must be grid friendly assets. It can be even more impactful than many generators on your system because they're so large and they're so they consume a lot of not only power but voltage, frequency, stability within certain systems. These are pretty advanced loads, right? They're not that paper mill I described, which essentially has an on and off button, right? So the paper mill had an on and off button, and it was either 100 megawatts or these loads are highly sophisticated. They're highly variable, and there's opportunity within its controllability to provide flexibility into the grid. And those are the opportunities. It's because they're a large source of both could be large source of voltage and frequency and energy. They could actually be grid resource and reduce the amount of transmission cost there would otherwise need to be if you didn't have that as a helpful resource. The other reason that they're very helpful is almost all of them are coming with backup standby generation. So that not only adds to the flexibility offerings, but working in conjunction with the local utility can actually increase the capability of the system if there's an opportunity to use that backup generation that comes with it.
Does that positive impact change at all when we're looking at this trend of hyperscalers really opting more for behind the meter, often natural gas behind the meter? What does that kind of trend look like in terms of impacts to reliability for the power grid, if anything at all?
This term we need to kind of help clarify a bit because there's a couple different options we see out there. And so, there's the, complete islanded system, right? You have the data centers that are completely islanded from the grid that are trying to self power. My understanding about that is not the preferred approach. That it's very difficult to get the level of reliability that they need on their own. Meaning, the level of reliability they can get from the power grid is unparamount and the most efficient option. And so that's but there are those who are doing then there's kind of that behind the meter more traditional sense that we think that they're connected to the grid. They are contracted for some certain amount, and they're also using self generation to maybe arbitrage or provide flexibility. And what's important about that is the grid is still planning to serve that load, but only up until that certain amount, right? And then they have to rely on their backup generation. So it's and even if some of those data centers aren't using the are self generating on their own more often, the grid is still reserving that capacity based on whatever contracted amount those data centers have.
Yeah. And it's helpful context and I think important background to make sure that it's clear kind of how all of these data centers operate, much like no two, regions in the US are the same when it comes to reliability, no two data centers are the same when it comes to their impacts on reliability. I do want to talk a little bit more about, the data centers as part of this larger tapestry of where we are today when we're thinking about grid reliability. NERC recently released a long-term reliability assessment. I know this is a project you spend quite a lot of time with.
Yeah.
The idea here is kind of predict over a 10-year horizon what reliability looks like. Um, a lot of uncertainty seemed to kind of be the theme of this most recent assessment. That the system is changing really quickly. Infrastructure might not necessarily be keeping up. I would love to hear a little bit more in your own words about what with all that we've talked about today, from the generation mix shifting, data centers, resource adequacy in general, what that means to you when you're thinking about the holistic view of reliability in the US in the coming decade. Tell me a little bit more at the high level of what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. Certainly that report we've been doing for quite some time, and we've mostly been doing it for the same way for quite some time. And the value in that is that we can kind of look at the historical record and see, where we were 10, 20 years ago, and kind of what shaped out over the next 10 years. And really in its full history that we've been doing this, more than about 60 years, NERC's been producing these long-term assessments. The risk map or our risk assessment of the next 5 to 10 years really hasn't been this risky really ever. And I think that is something that we really need to take hold of, take understanding of, and really, NERC is we're kind of putting the message out there. We can't do anything. We can't really do it on our own. We really need the partners at the state, the federal level, and industry, particularly in market areas to rectify that posture. There's certainly solutions that are being put in place. I like to kind of call them edge of your seat solutions. You might be, and listeners might be familiar with, the FERC and the markets advancing resource positions and resource integrations in certain market areas. And those have been very helpful, but, reliability, really shouldn't be a real time observation activity, right? It really is something that we ought to be planning in advance, making sure that we've got that reliability foundation, like you described, along with then we can kind of work on the affordability and security piece as well. So that those are kind of the challenges we have in front of us. Is really this risk posture we're in, and if we don't rectify that, you're kind of always digging. You're trying to always dig yourself out, right? Really try to get ahead of the capacity and transmission expansion, not behind, because the consequences, I don't think we really want to fully understand. Economic challenges, national security challenges, economic prosperity, health and safety. I think we've learned that in recent blackouts that have occurred during winter periods in particular. I don't feel old, but I'm young enough to remember, when we had a blackout when I was younger. It was kind of a fun activity. You went outside and you played soccer for a little bit, went inside, played board games, and you woke up and everything was back to normal. But really, the reality is the winter conditions where we expect some of the outages to occur, where the risk is popping up even further, is really challenging for health and safety and security. So that's going to be a hard thing to understand because we really haven't lived in that world. So we're hoping to kind of get the message out, and so we can really have long-term, durable solutions.
And before we get dig into what some of those potential solutions might look like, just because I'm curious, what regions are at the highest risk and why? You mentioned throughout this conversation that it sort of depends on where you are, the reliability that
Yeah.
you're looking at. Tell me a little bit more about some of the hot spots and the not so hot spots.
I think we talked about Texas as a hot spot. Those challenges have, and it's quite remarkable, right? Where again, for decades, Texas has always been built around air conditioning and summer loads, and prepare for the summer, and the whole system is really designed around that. And what we've come to find is that risk is really transitioning, still some in the summer, but really transitioning to where it's more concentrated during winter. Winter is really where the resource adequacy risks are in Texas. And again, largely because the resource choice, right? They built a lot of solar and storage, very helpful for summer peaks. Some other challenging areas are in MISO, in PJM, two of the largest, what we call independent system operators, regional transmission organizations. They're across the country. For many years, again, markets have been working as markets do. We've talked a lot about the long history of the system. And so I think this is a good example where, markets came in about a couple decades ago, help revolutionize how we think about bulk supply of generation and transmission and utilities and their involvement, and have done what markets do. We were probably at the time 60% reserve margins in some places, and markets have made areas more efficient. And in doing that, have really kind of gotten the margins down to right where they need to be. And the challenge with that is, you can kind of hover as you put solutions in place, as you build generation, and as generation might get delayed or deferred, your reliability targets might hover below or above your targets. The risk factor is, how long it takes to build certain generation. And so what contributes to that? Supply chain disruptions, uh, early retirement of resource of generation, as well as the permitting and kind of supply choice in different states. So, PJM and MISO have some challenges that are have to deal with getting the right resource mix and choice of supply, and keeping generation online that kind of wants to retire, but again are needed for reliability. Those are kind of couple areas of the country. I think other notable area of interest is kind of New England area that's got plenty of capacity, plenty of generation, but suffers from an energy potential energy deficits during your kind of real prolonged cold winter. They're at the end of a pipeline. They have a lot of generation that doesn't have firm rights to natural gas generation, and so a lot of generation is flying standby. Can get gas if natural gas is available, but those long and persistent winter cold spells can really deplete not only the gas but also the oil that they have in reserve. So that's why that area gets covered.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of the big questions that utility leaders are looking at when they're trying to figure out how to build a better grid, right? We're talking about building more effective transmission, making sure that we have the right resource mix, helping to ensure that permitting reform happens at any rate, right? I want to hear your perspective on what makes the biggest difference here. I mean, you mentioned specifically the pace of generation and transmission build out was a concern. What would fix it? Tell me a little bit about what some of the solutions look like in your view, from policymakers, from utility leaders. What could fix this problem?
The beauty about our system, you can say it's very challenging and bureaucratic and so many decision makers that it's hard to get things done. But you also can kind of step back and say it's brilliant because everybody has a say. And really, this is how we make decisions together on some of the most important crown jewels of our in our country and across North America. The challenges are making decisions and having the right type of data so that those decisions are can be reputably and confidently can be informed by those. And so it's one thing that NERC really tries to do really, 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 really hard, and kind of get that message about what are the reliability risks and how do we make decisions around whether or not more resources are needed. And so, fundamental to that, at the heart of that, I think one of the things that makes the most difference is, states have what we call resource adequacy criteria, and that's really states' responsibility to enforce those. Many of those are dated. Many of those have been relinquished to the ISO RTOs and markets to administer. Some areas are advancing. They're capturing the right types of resource adequacy criteria that's needed in kind of this modern world where we're going to a much different resource mix. Fundamentally, reserve margin, we talked about that a couple times. It really doesn't make a lot of sense when you have a lot of solar or a lot of wind on your system. It's really a dated metric. And if you're building only to a reserve margin, you have maybe a lot of solar and wind. It's really an inefficient, really ineffective uh, way to assess reliability and to be confident about where you are, and therefore very difficult to make decisions. So a good example of this is, if you've got a lot of wind and solar and you have a maybe a 15% reserve margin target, well, but yet there are challenges on your system, energy challenges during certain times of the year. It's going to be hard to write any checks or to justify additional infrastructure in those systems because they're above their reserve margin target, right? They meet criteria. It's like, well, yeah, but we have to understand that that criteria, it really isn't doesn't have any engineering soundness to it anymore now that the resource mix is so drastically changed. So there's this huge, I think, transition of learning and instituting better resource adequacy policies and criteria. We are we are seeing advancements there, but I think that that is the biggest thing that can really move um, and help make decisions for reliability.
Yeah. I mean, context is king, right? Understanding how the metrics for success, the definitions of success of the past might not necessarily meet this current moment, I think is one of the more tangible answers to that question that I have
Yeah.
gotten. So I appreciate that. So often when we're talking about what do we do next, it's, well, we might need this and we might need this hypothetical, and we're trying to prioritize affordability and all of that. But really, when we get down to brass tacks, there are specific changes that can be made. And I appreciate you running me through some of them, John. I think when we're looking at this question of reliability in the US across our grid, across North America right now, when we're looking at it at the highest level here, we've talked a lot about the details, we've talked a lot about the circumstances that matter most. A question I'm sure a lot of people have is just, how concerned should we be? What is the appropriate level of worry for reliability right now? I would love to hear your perspective on that before I let you go. How worried should we be?
Kind of we put ourselves in the consumers or the customers' shoes, and we've been talking a lot about um, risk to the system, really from a lack of energy perspective, right? We're concerned about the resource mix, and do we have enough energy during peak times or risky periods or dunkelflautes, right? But the customer kind of sees that, but they would also see these kind of other types of blackouts we didn't really kind of talk about, which are the instability, cascading, widespread outages, kind of like we saw in the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain. We've seen those in Chile, most recently in Australia as well. And a lot of these have to do with inverter based resource interaction with the grid, not having the right controls and reactive and frequency support. And so I think that's important because either because there's certain parts of the country that we do have a lot of inverter based resource challenges and just a lot of resources, California and Texas again. And so we're kind of worried about those types of blackouts too, not just if we have enough energy on the system. And so as a consumer, as kind of I'd be concerned, but I also know that the system planners and the system operators do some pretty fantastic work to keep the lights on. It's their ultimate goal, and they're very mission focused. They have a lot of resources, and they're very innovative sometimes, sharing resources when transmission is available. So they're able to do a lot. We also have the largest amount of demand response and demand flexibility that's ever been out there. Customer appeals for uh, 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 um, use reduction works when you send text messages out to people, notify people, people can prepare. So I think we're more resilient, maybe in a way, than we have been. That said, we're more reliant on electricity than we ever have. And I think that that's probably the most important point because we use a lot of we use electricity way more than keeping the lights on, right? It drives our whole everything we do. So I think everyone should be involved. Everyone should have their voice heard. Reliability and energy is made with decisions from everybody. So yeah, I think they need to be involved and they need to be concerned about it.
Yeah. Well, John, I think that's a fantastic way to wrap this conversation up, to think about what helps, what hinders, and what all of us can do, the role everybody can play, whether you are a utility leader listening to this, whether you are a lowly podcast host like myself. Having these kinds of conversations is always really interesting. So thank you so much for joining us today on Power Perspectives. I really appreciate your insights and your time.
Thanks, Kinsey. Great talking to you.
Of course. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to another episode of Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and I will see you next time.